Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take, a whole stack of sources and really try to figure out what's important, cutting through the noise.
Yeah, and today our mission is unpacking a pretty major legal development. It's shaking up U.S. trade policy, raising big questions about presidential power. We're digging into a recent CNN article that covers it all.
Right. The topic is this, well, frankly, surprising decision from a federal court. They've actually blocked a big chunk of recent U.S. tariffs from being imposed.
And why this matters to you, the listener, is pretty simple. These tariffs, they've hit costs
Mm.
for businesses, for consumers. So this ruling, it could potentially change that whole landscape.
Mm-hmm.
And it also sparks this really crucial debate about who actually gets to decide trade policy in the U.S.
So we're talking about a ruling from a court maybe you haven't heard much about, the U.S. Court of International Trade. It's down in Manhattan. Think of it as like a specialized arena for this kind of major legal fight.
Okay, so the core event, what happened? On Wednesday, May 28th, 2025, a three-judge panel there at the Court of International Trade ruled that President Trump basically overstepped his authority.
When imposing some of these big sweeping tariffs.
Exactly.
And the direct result, they issued a permanent injunction. So for you listening, that means the court is telling the government, stop enforcing these tariffs permanently, unless, of course, a higher court steps in.
Right. That injunction could potentially grind, well, the bulk of Trump's global tariffs to a halt, at least the ones under this specific authority.
Okay, let's get specific then. Which tariffs are we actually talking about here? Which ones are blocked?
So it blocks the tariffs that were imposed using emergency economic powers. That's under a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
IEPA, okay.
Yeah. So this includes things like those Liberation Day tariffs announced back on April 2nd. And it also stops the enforcement of earlier tariffs, the ones aimed at fentanyl trafficking against China, Mexico, and Canada.
Wow, okay, that sounds pretty broad then. What kind of rates are we talking about, like the actual numbers?
Specifically, it halts the 30% tariffs on China, the 25% ones on certain goods from Mexico and Canada, and also that 10% universal tariff that was hitting most goods coming into the U.S., again, under this IEEPA authority.
Okay, that's a huge list. A lot of goods potentially affected. But you said bulk. So what's not affected? What tariffs does this ruling leave untouched?
Yeah, important distinction. It does not touch the 25% tariffs on things like autos, auto parts, or steel and aluminum.
Right. And why not? Why are those specific ones okay, according to this court?
Because those were done under a different law. That's Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So while IEEPA is more about general economic emergencies, Section 232 is specifically about national security concerns, usually after some kind of investigation. Since this court ruling was laser-focused on the authority given by IEEPA, the Section 232 tariffs just weren't part of this decision. It's really critical to understand that split.
And the court didn't just, make a statement and leave it there. They ordered action. They gave the administration a 10-day window to get the orders in place to actually implement this permanent injunction.
And what's also pretty notable is that this ruling, it was unanimous. All three judges on the panel agreed. And the challenge itself came from kind of a mix of plaintiffs. You had small businesses involved and also a group of 12 Democratic states.
Okay, so this brings us right to the legal showdown, the core issue, authority. How did the administration argue these tariffs were legal in the first place? What was their justification?
So the administration under President Trump, they invoked IEPA, that law we mentioned. They cited unusual and extraordinary threats, declared a national economic emergency.
Right.
That was the justification for those reciprocal tariffs back in April, though some got paused later, and also for the fentanyl-related ones on China, Mexico, and Canada, using IEPA as the basis.
And the court just cut right through that argument, didn't they? That seems to be the central finding.
Absolutely. The court's main point was just, President Trump lacked the authority under IEP to do this. Full stop.
Okay, let's dig into that reasoning then. What was the court's logic? Why doesn't IEPA grant this power, in their view?
Right. This is where it gets really interesting legally. The court looks straight at the text, the actual words of the IEPA law, and their reasoning was essentially that IEPA doesn't mention tariffs.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the law lists other things a president can do in an emergency, block transactions, freeze assets, that kind of thing, but tariffs, not on the list.
Ah.
So the court said these specific tariff orders, whether they were worldwide or retaliatory or aimed at trafficking, they just went beyond any authority IEPA gives to regulate imports using tariffs.
Okay.
They also added that the trafficking tariffs failed specifically because, Well, even if IEP allowed some kind of action, these particular tariffs didn't really address the specific trafficking threats that were cited in the orders. It was a mismatch.
Okay, so the court is basically saying, look at the law you cited. It doesn't give you the tool you use, tariffs. Now, what about the plaintiffs? The small businesses, VOS selections, the Liberty Justice Center, those 12 states, what was their case?
Well, they came at it from a few angles. First, they argued the administration didn't even meet the basic requirements for declaring an emergency under IEPA to begin with.
But the court seems to have focused on the more fundamental point they made.
Exactly. Their main thrust, and what the court agreed on, was that IEPA simply doesn't give the president the power to enact tariffs. Period. Regardless of whether there's a real emergency or not.
And they took it a step further, too, right? There was a constitutional angle.
Yes, and it's a significant one. They argued that even if you could read IEPA as allowing tariffs, that reading would be an unconstitutional delegation of power from Congress, meaning the Constitution gives Congress the power to tax and regulate commerce. Their argument was that if IEPA let the president just impose tariffs like this, it would be Congress improperly giving away its own core power. They flat out called the tariffs illegally imposing tax hikes.
Right, framing it as a tremendous power grab, saying the president can't just use this law to slap on tariffs whenever they feel like it.
Yeah, that was their stance. Now, the administration, through the Department of Justice, their counter was basically, this is a political question.
Ah, the political question doctrine.
Exactly. They argued it's something for the president and Congress to sort out, not for the courts to jump into and decide.
It is kind of interesting to note the judges here, this three-judge panel appointed by different presidents, right? Reagan, Obama, Trump, across the spectrum.
Yeah, adds another layer. So how did people react? I mean, you had one expert calling this a surprising and spectacular decision. What was the fallout?
Well, the administration's reaction was immediate. Appeal the decision the same night it came down, Wednesday night. No delay.
And the White House. Pretty vocal, too, I imagine.
Oh, yeah. White House spokesperson Kush Desai said publicly something like, it's not for unelected judges to decide how to properly address a national emergency. And Stephen Miller, former White House Deputy Chief of Staff, he went on X, formerly Twitter, and posted that the judicial coup is out of control. Strong language.
Wow. Yeah. And the expert reactions, like you mentioned, Gary Clyde Huffbauer from the Peterson Institute, they really underscore how unusual this ruling is.
Right. He called it surprising and spectacular, specifically because usually these kinds of challenges against presidential emergency powers, they tend to lose. He pointed out that historically words like national security or national emergency, they've kind of acted like magic words. Courts often just accepted them as justification.
Yeah. Deference to the executive branch on those grounds. So what about businesses, especially the smaller ones? This must be potentially big news for them.
Potentially huge. These companies, especially small and medium-sized ones, they've really been struggling with the increased costs from these specific tariffs. Joe Brusuelas, chief economist at RSM US, he said it could be a huge relief for firms that neither have the margins nor the financial depth to absorb the tariffs on a sustained basis.
Right. So the plaintiffs who brought the suit must be pretty hopeful this holds up on appeal. Gives them some breathing room, some certainty maybe.
Definitely hopeful, yeah. They want that certainty for their businesses. And you saw a reflection of that potential impact in the markets too, right?
Yeah, the initial reaction was pretty strong. Stock futures jumped when the news broke. Dow futures up almost 500 points. S&P 500. NASDAQ futures also up significantly in after-hours trading. Markets seem to like the idea of fewer tariffs.
So the administration appealed immediately. What happens now? What does the road ahead look like?
Well, uncertainty is the word, right? For consumers, for companies.
Yeah.
Because of the appeal. The injunction is technically in place, but the legal fight continues.
And where does that fight go next?
The immediate next step is the Federal Circuit Court. That's the appeals court that hears cases from the Court of International Trade.
Okay.
But, given how important this is, the separation of powers, presidential authority, trade, it's possible it could even bypass that and go straight to the Supreme Court or end up there eventually.
Either path means this legal battle over these specific IEPA tariffs, it's probably going to drag on for a while, which means continued uncertainty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if the ruling holds up through all the appeals, the sources we looked at suggest it could be a really significant policy pivot point for the economy, maybe even for members of Congress who haven't been fans of the current trade policy. It could embolden them.
Okay, so let's just recap the main points here. We have this federal court, the U.S. Court of International Trade, issuing a permanent injunction. It could halt a big slice of recent U.S. tariffs.
Right. And they ruled the administration went beyond its authority under one specific law, i.e. EPA, based on how the court read the text of that law and the situation.
But the administration strongly disagrees. They say the court shouldn't even be ruling on this. It's a political question, and that it interferes with national emergency powers. And they've appealed immediately.
Yeah, it really throws that tension into sharp relief, doesn't it? The push and pull between what the executive branch wants to do on trade and the limits set by laws from Congress and ultimately the Constitution.
And for now, that uncertainty just hangs there as the appeal process starts.
And here's that key complexity again, this ruling. It's all about interpreting one specific law, i.e. EPA. Does it allow tariffs? The court said no.
Right. But, as we talked about, the administration has other tools, other laws they can use, like Section 232. That wasn't challenged here. Those steel and aluminum tariffs, still in place.
So what's the bottom line for you, the listener? It means this whole fight over who controls trade policy under what rules, it's really far from over. The outcome could genuinely affect the price of goods, the wider economy. It depends entirely on how these appeals turn out.
So here's a final thought, something provocative maybe, for you to mull over as this case goes forward.